We had more firepower than any army in history. But that morning in a Shau Valley, none of it mattered. My name is Daniel Harper. In June of 1969, I was 27 years old, a U.S. Army captain commanding Bravo Company, 1st Cavalry Division, Air Mobile. On the morning of June 17th, my company, 118 infantrymen, was ordered into the A Shau Valley. According to intelligence reports, the area had already been neutralized. For 3 days straight before our insertion, the valley had been hit hard. Two B-52 arc light strikes, more than 400 rounds of 155mm artillery, multiple tactical airstrikes by F-4 Phantom jets. On our maps, the assessment was simple: enemy presence likely neutralized. In plain terms, we believed the valley was dead. In Vietnam, that belief was often the first mistake. At 05:32 in the morning, UH-1 Huey helicopters dropped us into 3 small landing zones, each less than 400 meters apart. The jungle below was blackened and torn apart. Trees were snapped. The ground still smoked. I split Bravo Company into 3 platoons, roughly 40 men each. We advanced in a dispersed formation, spacing soldiers 5 to 7 meters apart. The logic was standard doctrine: reduce casualties from ambushes or artillery fire. On paper, it was the right decision. In dense jungle, it also meant something else. It meant we could be isolated, one squad at a time. We moved forward slowly, no gunfire, no mines, no contact. The silence didn't calm anyone. It felt unnatural. What we didn't know was that fewer than 50 meters from our formation, nearly 90 enemy soldiers were already moving with us. They didn't build bunkers. They didn't dig in. They didn't fire from a distance. They broke into small teams of 3 to 5 men and advanced parallel to our movement, always staying close enough to hear our commands, observe our spacing, and most importantly, stay too close for us to safely call in air support. This wasn't a typical ambush. It was a calculated effort to neutralize American firepower before it could be used. At 06:07, the first shot was fired, not from the edge of the jungle, not from a distant ridgeline. It came from directly in front of 2nd Platoon. The distance was less than 20 meters. In seconds, the formation collapsed. Radio traffic overlapped into confusion. Men went down before they could identify where the fire was coming from. By instinct, I gave the order every American officer depended on: call air support, now. But as the radio operator tried to pass coordinates, the problem became obvious. There were no safe coordinates. The enemy was too close, too mixed in with our own men. At that distance, air power wasn't an advantage. It was a danger. That was the moment I understood something no briefing had ever explained. We weren't being defeated by superior weapons. We were being defeated by proximity. They didn't need to destroy us. They only needed to get close enough to make our greatest strengths unusable. And this fight had only just begun. Once the shooting started, my first priority was control. Firefights in Vietnam weren't won by bravery alone. They were won by coordination: who could see, who could communicate, who could bring in support. I ordered the platoon leaders to tighten their formations and establish overlapping fields of fire. On paper, it made sense. In reality, the jungle didn't allow clean lines or clear angles. Visibility dropped to less than 30 meters, sometimes less than 10. Every time one squad tried to maneuver, another would lose sight of them entirely. Radio calls overlapped, voices tense, some barely audible through the static. We were still thinking in terms of maneuver warfare. The enemy was already thinking in terms of proximity. By doctrine, this was the moment American air power should have ended the fight. I requested close air support twice within the first 15 minutes. The pilots responded immediately. They were already circling overhead. Then came the same question, repeated again and again. How close are friendly forces to the enemy? The answer never changed. Too close. The enemy stayed within 20 meters of our positions, sometimes closer. They didn't charge recklessly. They moved with discipline, shifting positions just enough to stay inside the danger zone where bombs and rockets couldn't be used. At that range, a single misjudgment would have wiped out our own men. Air power wasn't denied by weather. It wasn't denied by terrain. It was denied by human distance. As the fighting continued, something became clear. They weren't trying to annihilate us. If that had been their goal, they would have concentrated fire, tried to break a platoon completely, or cut off our withdrawal routes. Instead, they focused on maintaining contact. Whenever one of our squads attempted to pull back, another enemy element pressed in. Whenever we tried to advance, they faded just enough to pull us forward, then close the gap again. Their objective wasn't destruction, it was fixation. As long as we were pinned in close combat, we couldn't bring artillery closer than 300 meters. We couldn't mark targets for airstrikes. We couldn't even reposition without risking friendly fire. They were turning our strength into dead weight. By midday, the cost was becoming clear. We had taken casualties, several killed, more wounded. Evacuation was difficult. Medevac helicopters couldn't land safely, and hovering too low made them targets. Every evacuation required a temporary lull in fighting, and every lull gave the enemy time to reposition even closer. Time stopped working in our favor. The longer we stayed, the more exhausted my men became. Ammunition dropped, water ran low, sweat soaked through uniforms, mixing with dirt and blood. The enemy, by contrast, dictated the tempo. They decided when the fighting surged and when it faded. That kind of control doesn't come from superior weapons. It comes from understanding the battlefield better than the other side. By late afternoon, I had to face reality. We were not losing because we lacked firepower. We were losing because we couldn't apply it. Every doctrine I had been trained to rely on, air superiority, artillery dominance, mobility, was being neutralized by a single factor: closeness. The enemy had turned the battlefield into a space where technology meant less than positioning. As darkness approached, I requested permission to disengage. The order came back shortly after. Begin a controlled withdrawal before nightfall. It wasn't a defeat in the traditional sense, but it was a lesson none of us would forget. We would leave the valley before nightfall, but the valley had already taught us its lesson. The order to disengage came in the late afternoon. On paper, a withdrawal is simple. You pull units back by bounds, maintain security, evacuate the wounded, and break contact. In reality, disengaging from an enemy who refuses to let go is one of the most dangerous maneuvers in warfare. I ordered 1st Platoon to hold position while 2nd Platoon began moving back 50 meters at a time. 3rd Platoon was tasked with rear security. Every movement was slow, deliberate, and exhausting. The enemy stayed close. Not aggressively, not recklessly, just close enough. They fired sporadically, short bursts, single shots, never enough to trigger a full counterattack, but enough to remind us they were still there. They weren't chasing us, they were escorting us out on their terms. As the light began to fade, the jungle transformed. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. Shadows stretched between the trees, sounds carried farther, but directions became harder to judge. This was the moment I feared most. Night fighting in Vietnam favored those who knew the terrain intimately. We relied on radios, flares, and coordination. The enemy relied on memory and instinct. I requested illumination rounds and aerial flares. We got a few, but not enough to maintain constant visibility. The enemy understood this transition perfectly. Their movements became quieter, their presence harder to detect. They didn't press harder at night. They didn't need to. Then something unexpected happened. They began to pull away. Not all at once, not obviously, but gradually, almost imperceptibly, the pressure eased. The close gunfire stopped. The movement sounds faded. The jungle went quiet again. We expected a final ambush. It never came. By the time full darkness settled in, the enemy was gone. No pursuit, no harassment, no attempt to exploit our vulnerability. They vanished into the terrain as if they had never been there. That was when I realized the most unsettling truth of the entire engagement. They had never intended to stay. We regrouped several kilometers away, just outside the valley. Casualty reports came in, ammunition was redistributed, wounded were finally evacuated once helicopters could land safely. On paper, we were still combat effective. But tactically, the enemy had achieved everything they wanted. They had forced us to abandon the operation, neutralized our air and artillery support for an entire day, controlled the tempo of the fight from start to finish, withdrawn with minimal losses. They never needed to destroy Bravo Company. They only needed to prove that our advantages could be taken away. That kind of victory doesn't show up clearly in after-action reports, but it stays with the men who lived through it. That night, as I sat on my pack and listened to the jungle settle, I understood something that would shape every decision I made afterward. Firepower is only useful when you are allowed to use it. Technology matters until the battlefield shrinks. Doctrine matters until the enemy refuses to fight the way you expect. In a Shau Valley, we weren't beaten by superior force. We were beaten by a strategy that understood us better than we understood it. And long after we left that valley, that lesson followed American units across Vietnam. Because the enemy didn't need to win every battle. They only needed to fight close enough to make winning impossible. They didn't defeat our army. They defeated the way our army fought. Weeks after the operation, I was asked to contribute to the after-action report. The report focused on numbers, casualties, rounds fired, air sorties requested and denied. On paper, the engagement looked inconclusive. No decisive victory on either side. No territory permanently lost. But reports rarely capture what actually matters. What mattered in a Shau Valley wasn't how many men were killed. It was how completely our operational model had been disrupted. We were built to fight with distance. They were built to remove it. Their entire approach rested on one simple idea: proximity control. They understood exactly how American firepower worked and, more importantly, how it failed. Airstrikes required separation. Artillery required coordinates. Helicopter mobility required space. By staying within 20 to 30 meters of our units, they collapsed all those requirements at once. They didn't need to shoot constantly. They didn't need to expose themselves. They only needed to remain present. As long as contact was maintained, our options disappeared one by one. This wasn't desperation. It was design. People often assume that superior forces can always adjust. That's only true if adjustment doesn't undermine the system itself. To counter their proximity tactics, we would have needed to fight without relying on air or artillery, operate in tighter formations, increasing risk, accept higher casualties in close combat. None of those options fit American doctrine in 1969. Our system prioritized minimizing casualties through technology. Their system accepted casualties to negate technology. That imbalance wasn't tactical, it was philosophical. And philosophy doesn't change in the middle of a firefight. The most damaging impact wasn't physical, it was psychological. My men trusted air support the way sailors trust lifeboats. Knowing it was there shaped how we moved, how we planned, how we took risks. In a Shau Valley, that trust was stripped away. When soldiers realize their safety net no longer works, hesitation replaces confidence. Every movement feels exposed. Every decision feels heavier. The enemy understood that. By staying close, they forced us to fight with uncertainty instead of superiority. That uncertainty stayed with my men long after the operation ended. A Shau Valley was not unique. Similar tactics were being reported across central Vietnam. Small units maintaining close contact, denying fire support, disengaging at will. Each engagement reinforced the same conclusion. We could win battles, we could destroy positions, but we couldn't force an enemy to fight on our terms. And as long as that remained true, every victory carried limits. The valley didn't defeat us. It revealed the boundaries of our power. History says we lost Vietnam for many reasons, but in places like a Shau Valley, I learned how. Years have passed since that day in June of 1969. Time has a way of stripping battles down to their essentials. The noise fades, the fear dulls. What remains is understanding. When I think back on a Shau Valley, I no longer picture the gunfire first. I picture the spacing between men, the way the jungle closed in, the way our advantages quietly disappeared one by one. We didn't walk into a trap made of explosives. We walked into a trap made of space, or rather the lack of it. That valley wasn't important because of its location. It was important because of what it revealed. The U.S. Army of the 1960s was designed to fight a very specific kind of war. A war with front lines, a war with clear targets, a war where superiority and firepower translated directly into control. In that kind of war, distance is an ally. In Vietnam, distance became a liability. The enemy understood that better than we did. They didn't try to match our strength. They attacked the assumptions behind it. They fought close, not because they lacked options, but because closeness was the option that worked. Many people ask why we didn't simply change tactics. The answer is uncomfortable. To counter their approach, we would have had to fight a different war, one with higher casualties, fewer technological safeguards, and less predictability. That wasn't something a democratic society easily accepted. The enemy knew that. They didn't need to defeat us militarily. They needed to make the cost of victory unacceptable. By forcing close combat again and again, They pushed the war into a space where American advantages no longer guaranteed results. And over time, that space grew larger than any single battlefield. In a Shau Valley, neither side claimed a decisive victory. We withdrew, they disappeared. The valley remained. But winning isn't always about holding ground. Sometimes it's about shaping the terms of the war. They force us to fight in ways that drain time, morale, and certainty. Each engagement raised questions no amount of firepower could fully answer. How close is too close? How much control is enough? How long can superiority survive without clarity? Those questions followed us home. If a Shau Valley taught me one final lesson, it was this. War is not decided by weapons alone. It is decided by understanding of terrain, of people, and of limits. The enemy understood our limits. They knew when to fight. They knew when to disappear. And most importantly, they knew how to fight in a way that made our strengths irrelevant. That is why places like a Shau Valley matter, not because of what was destroyed there, but because of what was learned.